Hello everyone, greetings from the Servant of Nero, AJ here, and this one covers an aspect of the world that is, again, quaint, but almost entirely unnecessary, in terms of knowing about the setting from a functional perspective, and is thus a nice quirky touch by the writers. Dueling is something that is, as far as both story and gameplay is concerned, exclusive to IKRPG. To the best of my knowledge, Layli's fluff doesn't really feature many noteworthy duels that contribute to War Machine and Horde's storyline, however tangentially, with the exception of cursory mentions in some characters' lore. Indeed, most duels called out in the lore relate to Signaran or Ordic history rather than Layli's, even though it is a much more significant part of that latter nation's culture. That said, there is no shortage of variety when observing how various peoples of Immoren go about fighting one versus one. Codified dueling is an odd quirk of human culture, for no other race attaches so much weight to what might be a completely inconsequential act of bluster between two individuals. Certainly, it is only codified by human cultures, for most races of Immoren engage in some form of one-to-one combat to settle arguments in continuous traditions that are perhaps thousands of years old. Even so, the most prolific incidents of formalized and ritualized dueling between individuals in accordance to written rules can be found in Layli's history, and even their occupation in parts by the Khadoran Empire and the Northern Crusade of the Protectorate of Menoth has not discouraged corners of Layli's society from resolving their disputes using duels. From what we know of the gravity associated with these traditions among some parts of their nobility, it would not be surprising to know that they continued to duel amidst the infernal invasion. In any event, dueling in human history dates back to the early days of civilization. The encounter between Horfar Grimnir of the Mulgar Confederation and Priest King Golovant of Caspia is perhaps one of the most famous duels of humanity's ancient history. During the Warlord era, it was common for disagreements to be resolved by violent means, but the desire to remain alive often overrides the desire to be victorious in a dispute. Thus, when one village took offence from another, it became increasingly common for each to nominate a champion who would fight for their respective village's honour. Most conflicts would be satisfied by such a process, and only in the most serious cases would it escalate to skirmishing between the people of each settlement. Blessed few, relatively speaking, escalated to regional conflicts and war. As a means of satisfying grievances on a regional scale, it died away with the coming of the Thousand Cities era, and instead became a more personal affair among those jurisdictions that either allowed or encouraged it. While many Western Emery states would permit dueling, it was generally disfavoured by many populations, or discouraged by those states that were better able to enforce their laws. Extra-legal dueling would continue, though, and in many cases legal systems would turn a blind eye to such arrangements, especially away from the increasingly urbanized centers of modernizing civilization. Consequently, ritualized dueling became a preserve of the lawless havens of the pirates and the rising kingdom of Rhaenyra. Over time, the Rhinish added layers and layers of ceremony and protocol before eventually codifying it in what would eventually become the Code Duello that is still used by the Laylis today. Even the Orgoth occupation did not stop or significantly reduce dueling. The Orgoth tyrants only needed subservience from the peoples that they subjugated, and to an extent, disunity was welcome to them, provided it kept the conquered weak. They were careful to keep the conflicts at a level where they remained petty, as instability was something that they wished to avoid. The Khadoran administrators in occupied Lael held similar attitudes, if with perhaps more pointed contempt. But it was after the expulsion of the Orgoth that dueling truly became an aspect of culture in the Iron Kingdoms, especially and predictably in Lael, the successor to the kingdom of Rhaenyra, so much so that the Laelese Umbrians quickly came to adopt their Rhinish neighbours' traditions. Indeed, the norms of the duello would eventually be adopted by much of the remainder of the Iron Kingdom to some extent. Even so, the ethnic Rhinish would always be the people most steeped in the history of the duel between individuals, at least among the human nations. Over time, the weapons and equipment used in dueling changed as well. In generations past, combatants would fight with whatever weapons they brought, or they could agree what weapons to fight with, be it ranged or melee, polearm or dagger. In modern times, though, dueling in the Laylis manner means doing so with the rapier for the most part, in professional circles, with additional equipment used by agreement. Gunslingers, given more to outlaw surrounds, will, naturally, be more inclined to dueling with pistols. Overall, however, the Code Duello details a complete code of conduct that is strictly followed by the Laylis. Noble and otherwise, duelist and otherwise, as duels are often grand spectacles, to the extent that it is almost an additional document to their legal code. From the timing of issuing a challenge, to the nature of the attendant witnesses and seconds to conduct post-duel, every step of the process is itemized and honourable behaviour is described for each, including potential contingencies, or lack thereof, adjudication, and even continuation, adjournment, or repetition, should one party or the other feel that honour has not been restored in a satisfactory manner. Duelling is treated with such gravity in Lael that there is a whole industry associated with it. Many senior nobles hire professional duelists as bodyguards, whether for practical intent or simply for show. There is as much as a tournament cycle with substantial prize purses for the winners. Numerous training schools are dotted throughout Lael for prospective duelists, also providing retired duelists with a vocation of sorts. Many smiths and craftsmen make equipment, whether offensive or protective, used specifically in duels, and so on and so forth. As duelling is often a matter of personal honour, and individuals who are not professional or trained fighters can sometimes find themselves in a duel, deloping is an important concept of the duello, and unique to duelling among humans. It is described as an occasion whereby one or both parties fire their pistol with the intention of missing their opposite number, and their seconds judge that the dispute is ended. This allows the participants to depart with honour and life both intact. However, it does rely on both parties implicitly agreeing to do so beforehand, as should one do so, the other may take a free shot without repercussion under the terms of the code. Such is the code's completeness in considering all outcomes. Most other nations or races have a culture of formalized and ritualized dueling, though perhaps not to this extent. The Skorne have perhaps the closest to widespread dueling culture by Laelese definitions, but the causes and results of Skorne dueling tend to have a great deal more significance attached to them, based on what records exist. Unlike Rhinish and Laelese dueling, Skorne dueling is very perfunctory, and there is next to no ritual or ceremony attached to it. As a very martial culture, weapons are taken as a matter of course, and combatants wield what they have within reach, usually at their waist or back, though it should be noted that in accordance with the Hoksune, only melee weapons are permitted in polite society, shall we say. And while dueling may arguably be traditional in Skorne culture, particularly the Malzash, it isn't codified as far as we know, and typical behaviour, whether of spectators or the duelists themselves, is a matter of common sense. Common sense in a strictly Skorne definition, of course. When a duel is called and all observe the challenger to be earnest in their challenge, space is provided and none will interrupt proceedings, even if it may be right there and then. Interfering with a duel will undoubtedly draw the ire of one, if not both combatants, and it is often considered a grave insult. Duels between Skorne are almost always fatal, as a weak warrior's death is considered good for all of Skorne, so a duel to the death is a great deal more common than in any other culture. Occasionally, duels can be so debilitating to the losing party, physically, that they are either put out of their misery in the aftermath, or socially, so as to be outcast and even unpersoned in Skorne records, should they be especially reviled. But duels can occur for seemingly no other reason than to test the martial skill between the warriors, though these will typically end at first blood, and can occur even between friends. This is the most common form of duel when young prospective Skorne warriors seek to join the ranks of their house's Praetorians. Observers often consider this as more sparring than anything else, however, though the Skorne themselves view it as a form of dueling. On the other hand, what the Trollkin have may be termed dueling perhaps only by the most charitable of non-Trollkin observers. Creoles often have to resolve disputes among their number, but they are a simple race in terms of social mores and prefer things that way, even if there might be a certain intricacy to it. As such, Trollkin that have a trivial quarrel between them will often allow their arguments to descend into a brawl that, given that races innately high constitution and capacity for healing, rarely end in the death of a participant. Instead, they spontaneously fight and unarmed because they do not wish to be so petty concerning fellow Trollkin lives. Brawling continues until they are tired, forget why they started fighting in the first place, or want to continue drinking. Serious disagreements may result in armed combat that is held in full view of the remainder of the Creel at the Couloir, a stone platform which is the Creel's site for public assemblies. Victory is achieved when one Trollkin forces the other down from the Couloir. However, beneath this perhaps stereotypical physicality, the Trollkin are, against most expectations of them, the only race who perform a more psychological form of dueling. A test of wills, the Tohmaak Mahkeiri, roughly translated as glimpse into the mind, is as much a greeting as a challenge, whereupon two Trollkin will clasp each other's heads and gaze into the other's eyes. They do so to show that they are forthright and honourable before their peers, while studying to see if their opposite number is insincere or untrustworthy. There is no winner or loser per se, but should one Trollkin turn aside prematurely, then they may be judged deceitful by their opponent and witnesses. The more antagonistic form of this is the Grohmat Mahkeiri, or Battle of the Mind, which are more outright battles of wills which test the strength of Trollkin's psyche, possible thanks to the bonds of blood held among all troll kind. Such duels are used for far more serious affairs that deserve more than a mere tavern brawl or what amounts to a stiff handshake, and while rarely fatal, Grohmat Mahkeiri are exhausting trials and have caused some to fall into a coma. Of a more straightforwardly primal form of dueling, the Tharn also engage in such head-to-head combat, though their reasoning is typically more associated with such abstract ideas as survival of the fittest. Should a Tharn warrior consider their chief to be weak, for example, they can challenge them. What follows is essentially a cussing match with a great deal of self-aggrandizement mixed in. While a duel can continue down its vein, it often proceeds to more brutal conduct, and the challenged will retaliate, usually without caring much for where or when the fight takes place. The duel can end in a number of ways, whether it be the death of one fighter, ritual humiliation, or effective ostracism. It is never bloodless, however, and depending on the ferocity of the combat, onlookers can be caught up in it, should they not take sufficient care to avoid being attacked unintentionally. More conventionally, there are the Hoarluk dwarves. As a race, they have a culture of dueling, but it is not particularly pervasive. Clan conflicts can be resolved in any number of ways, up to and including an adjudicated war of sorts. But no matter how it is obtained, the result must be upheld to conclude the clan dispute, or feud in the event violence is allowed to break out between the aggrieved. However, the dwarves are aware of dueling culture among the human nations. Thus, should a Hoarluk dwarf find themselves abroad and away from clan representation, they may offer the duel offending parties to deal with the problem. This is also a possible course of action should a clan find themselves in disagreement with either an individual or an organization that is not bound by the laws of the Codex. Even so, duels between dwarves on behalf of their clans are far from unheard of, and they can be just as elaborate, or obfuscating in contrast to Laerlese conventions. Ultimately, it serves as one of the many stages of escalating conflict between clans. Instead of using seconds, though, they will often call upon priests or clan lords to preside over the combat, depending on circumstances. Their Ogren clansfolk have their own mode of dueling, but since records are not kept of them, we know little of how they undertake such activity, except that it involves unarmed wrestling that is overseen by village elders. Meanwhile, in Ios, dueling is ostensibly illegal, but individuals occasionally engage in ritualized combat should they feel the courts would not come to a suitable conclusion. Even so, duels in Ios are comparatively uncommon, and few bear witness to them. Despite there being no written code of conduct relating to dueling as exists in Laerlese or Hoarluk culture, there is nonetheless a large measure of ceremony attached to it. Conversely, while they are a matter of public record, whether written or verbal, in those two neighbouring nations, in Ios it is considered to be a most intimate and personal affair. Explaining why challenges for duels are issued directly, the duels themselves are arranged for inopportune times to be witnessed, and held in locations away from the eyes of those that would not be concerned. A minimal number of observers are advised, including neutral interests, to ensure a fair duel, and thus few attend to spectate such duels, to whom also goes the responsibility of informing the acquaintance of the defeated, should a fight to the death be agreed. Most duels are to first blood, though, and in keeping with the more intimate nature of duels between Iosans, melee weapons are the predominant choice, though it is not unknown for those with arcane ability to use said skill, should both duelists possess it and agree to its use. Thus, we can safely state that the nature of dueling covers quite a span of social norms across the peoples of Immoren. So it is not surprising that not all races are so understanding of the culture of others in such matters as these, even if some instances of dueling between individuals from different races are known, and even out of the military challenge setting. But as events progress, who knows if it will continue to be normal in the years to come, or if, when the Infernals are done with their business, future generations may return to such parochial methods of diplomacy, should diplomacy even remain relevant or possible.